a caste-based society is the best foundation for the future. People might react badly to that because, they assume that I mean a caste-based society, as it has existed in the past. What I mean is one wholly original and wholly new that takes inspiration from those of the past, but with none of the negative baggage and none of the flawed reasoning found in anything that has existed before. I think what we need is a society in which everyone has a well-defined place and everyone understands what he or she is there to do and what he or she is, what is expected of every individual of a society. That's where most of today's ills, not even in the modern age, but just in most of human history, I think a great deal of difficulty has arisen from people not having a good sense of who they are and what they're there to do and what their purpose is in the broader world. And of course, individual exploration is essential and healthy, and people should figure out who they are and what they are meant to do. But they also need help. People also need help to understand who they are and what they're meant to do. In today's world, think about how everyone struggles to define themselves, or not everyone. Many people struggle to define themselves. They need some kind of identity beyond who they are as an individual. And I don't think everyone is like that. I don't consider myself like that. I feel very comfortable being an individual, being who I am, being Dylan Newkirk. But I have certainly found that most people require something else to base their lives on, to build off of. They need some kind of identity, some kind of allegiance that goes beyond who they are as an individual. I think most people are like that. I think most human beings are like that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. How could there be when that is simply how most people are? Most people need some kind of, they need a role. They need a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves in order to feel complete, in order to feel as though they understand their place in the world and in any group, in any society. That's why people define themselves by various things. They define themselves by their job, by their career. Like what practical purpose do I serve in society? They define themselves by what they look like. Skin color, sex. Things like that. Religion, of course. People define themselves. They derive their identity often, primarily from their religious affiliation. And these are all important, and I'm not saying any of these are invalid. It's just that I'm not sure that any of them, perhaps with the exception of religion, but I'm not sure that the others, the more limited aspects of what people consider their identity, I'm not sure those things can truly provide the sense of identity and belonging and meaning and purpose that people crave. I think most people need something more. I think they need to more clearly be able to say, this is who I am and this is what I'm here to do. And I think that's where a division of society on clearly defined lines of purpose could be very helpful. I think that if we were to sort people in such a way that they could have a clear sense of identity and purpose and meaning, it would result in a healthier civilization. It would result in a healthier humanity, because people would not constantly be grasping at anything they could find to explain who they are. It would simply be, this is who I am. There would be no doubt, very little doubt in it. Because you would simply say, this is my caste, this is this is my category, this is what I'm here to do, this is the function I serve in society, and it would be very clear and orderly, and people would understand it. Implicitly, there would be an implicit understanding that that something like a career or anything like that, any other of the like the voluntary affiliations we choose to assume as our identities in modern life. Those things can never truly provide order and clarity and meaning, because they're just they're fragile constructs. They're people change jobs. A lot of people will never get the career that they want. They never may not ever be able to satisfactorily define themselves in those terms. And so I think being able to more fully describe oneself, in the context of broader society is very helpful. And similarly with involuntary, intrinsic characteristics that people seek an identity from, those sometimes have a stronger pull, a stronger sense of reality. Things like race, like skin color, like sex, things like that. People identify themselves as these things first and foremost, and they group themselves with other people like that, and they consider that to be their larger identity, and that can work to an extent, but I find that is ultimately it's like a medium-term solution to seeking social cohesion, or trying to have a really good civilization. I think that if you base yourself off of like, this is the this is the ethnic nation we belong to, or that kind of thing, I mean, that can last for a while, but that also it certainly can't last forever, because 2,000 years in the future, today's races, ethnicities, nations will probably be part of history, and things will have changed. I mean, I can't claim to know exactly how dramatically they will change, but I do think they will have changed so dramatically that if you identify yourself merely as that in the here and now, then obviously anyone who does that will be long dead in 2,000 years, but if supposing you lived that long, I think you would find yourself potentially without a people, and potentially without an identity, because those things can only last for so long. Everything is constantly in flux. Humanity is constantly changing and shifting, and we aren't, we'll probably never reach any kind of stasis, and nor should we, because that would be perverse if we reached any kind of true total stasis. We always have to change, and I'm talking about biologically and ethnically and things like that. It would be really strange if everything just never changed. But and then also a religion. I should mention religion. Religion is probably the strongest of these self-identifying characteristics, because religion is a voluntary thing. You take up religion. I should say in theory it's voluntary. Many people, of course, don't especially have a choice, So that's true. But I'm speaking in the sense of, if you're seeking an identity and then you voluntarily choose your religious or spiritual affiliation as the answer to that, question of identity, that is probably the strongest of all of these three categories I've described of things you could take as your identity and use to define yourself. And that is because it is in theory anyway, religion is a choice. You choose what faith you want to follow, and then you can identify as that, and it doesn't limit you the same way that your strict day-to-day functionality or intrinsic characteristics like race or sex or anything like that doesn't limit you in that same way, because religion, at least, well, I should say most, universal religions, which are, is what most people subscribe to today, is, if it's a universal religion, then as long as someone is a part of that group, a part of your religion, then you can consider them part of your group, and you can help define your identity by that shared group. And it's as long as you have a large enough religion, it's very open. Like you can identify yourself as a Christian, and then just like any Christian anywhere in the world, you can say, like, you are like me, you are my comrade, you're my compatriot, we are the same, and so we have loyalty to each other. But then the issue with that is that religions often struggle to fully dominate civil society. They there are so many nations and so many states throughout history that have identified themselves strongly as, like a Christian nation, an Islamic nation, whatever. And they often are staunchly aligned to that religion, to that faith, but they also don't necessarily, everyone in that nation is not necessarily truly faithful. And, that's just human nature, is that people will, to varying degrees, be pious and be faithful and be genuine in their devotion and their proclaimed devotion. Because a lot of people, if it is a nation that defines itself as being of a particular faith, then everyone to some extent is obligated to go along with it out of social convenience and convention and practicality, regardless of what their actual feelings on the matter are. And so defining yourself as religion, by religion, not as religion, works pretty well, but also then you run into the problem of, people in your culture, in your society, people who do not share your religion, do not share your faith, do not share your outlook on things. I find that people have a hard time relating to people like that, and they have a hard time considering themselves as, true fellows, true brothers and sisters. I find that they, because they're always trying to convert people. Not always, but there's always the kind of like notion of moral superiority, whether or not it's thought of in those terms. But there's always the idea that, like, well, I know better. I know better than these heathens who are like fellow citizens of this nation, and so there's going to be some inevitable social friction, if not outright strife, stemming from that. So, and religion can potentially, it could theoretically endure forever, and so it does have the benefit of potentially lasting forever. Not necessarily, of course, but it's possible. Unlike some of these other things, unlike defining yourself by your function in terms of a day-to-day stuff in society, or defining yourself by what you look like or what your body functions like. And that is why I maintain that the perfect society would be one in which there are a set of castes, a set of divisions between all citizens belonging to that society, and everyone would be would belong to one of these castes, but it would not be based on birth, at least not ultimately. and there would be a great deal of freedom of movement between these castes, and that's critical, because caste-based societies in the modern day, or I should say in the past and the modern day, struggle, of course, because they're usually it's kind of like an extreme form of just a class-based society where it's a strictly hierarchical kind of thing, and there's like a clearly superior, clearly inferior caste, things like that. And I don't that wouldn't be helpful. That's terribly outdated, and I don't think that would last very well. It would probably not function at all in the modern world. The modern world requires modern solutions, and so you would need a society in which belong to a clearly defined caste, one in which they could move to another when convenient or necessary, because people, of course, don't necessarily maintain the same characteristics or strengths from one phase of life to the next. People struggle to find themselves, and I think an ideal society would have to accept that and acknowledge that and provide adequate means for people to do so. But at the same time, it would require proving yourself. It would require proving yourself deserving of that opportunity. People would have to demonstrate that they truly are better suited to one caste versus another. It couldn't be just a whim. It couldn't, if someone is not suited to the role of one caste in society, then they would be denied. They would have to remain where they are. And that would be for the better of everyone, including the person seeking to change roles in society. Because if someone genuinely isn't well suited for such a change, then it would be for the best. But if they are well suited for a different role, then they would be given that opportunity very freely. It would just require proving that someone is deserving of it. That implies a moral quality to it, and that's not what I mean at all. I mean simply that someone would be well suited for a different task, for a different role. And once demonstrated, it would be required of society to provide them with that different role and that different opportunity. Think of it like the human body. Of course, it would begin with the body, with the trunk, with the core, with the viscera, and that would be the majority of people in this caste-based society that I'm envisioning. And they would represent the body. They would represent the corpus of humanity, of the ideal society, and they would essentially not be so different from the people of today. They would simply have a better, they would be generalists. They would be most of the, they would be all workers, all quote unquote ordinary people, which is not meant in a derogatory way or anything. It's just an acknowledgement that most people are, average. Well, I should say most, not saying most people are average, but, there is most people are not well suited for leadership. Most people are not well suited for pursuits of high intellect. And that's not anything to be ashamed of. That's nothing to judge people by. It's simply acknowledging reality. And I think that's, because as I see it, in today's world, in most of, most of the world, most of the, the first world, most of the, the technologically advanced world, the industrialized world, most cultures today value the intellectual, and they value at least in theory, they value the positions of, presumed great importance. They value the roles in society that where where people stand high above others and they lord it over their fellow man. And I mean, people don't think of it in that way, but scientists, elected officials, the wealthy, just any basically, if you aren't in modern day American society, for example, if you aren't seen as being special, then people look down on you. People judge you for that. And yet yet the idea of social equality and an egalitarian kind of mindset, that prevails on the surface, but then realistically, people look down on the blue collar type of person. They look down on people who simply are average people. And they don't admit it, but I think if you read between the lines, that's definitely the impression you get. People are deemed as gifted and talented, and implicitly there's this kind of notion of they're more deserving of laurels than people who are perhaps not as intelligent, perhaps not as talented, but the people like that might be ultimately more worthy than some of the highly gifted, highly talented type of person, because these average people, these ordinary people, often have, well, I shouldn't say often, because it's not like it is, if anything, truly random between the different strata of society, but these sort of average people, I have found, are sometimes, or they are sometimes more valuable than people with with more raw talent or raw intelligence, because they have superior moral character. They have a better character. They are just better people overall, even if they aren't necessarily capable in practical terms of some of the things that society might deem their betters. And that's perverse. We shouldn't encourage that. We should hold up virtue, and we should hold up decency and good moral character as the prime consideration of our society if we want it to last. And so the majority of people, probably 75%, would be in the body, the corpus, the base caste. And then there would be, of course, one arm, the left arm, would constitute scientists and intellectuals of that bent. And then the right arm would constitute the warriors of society, the military, soldiers, people who are well suited to protect and defend the entire collective. Perhaps collective is a bad word, but the entire combined civilization, the entire combined society, as represented by all the body parts put together. And then atop these, of course, you would have the head, and that would be the leadership caste. That would be the people best suited for leadership, obviously. And that, of course, would be the smallest caste, and that would be mostly hereditary based, but also with plenty of room for upward mobility from the other castes, because anyone who is capable of demonstrating that he or she should belong to a different caste and has the desire to do so must be relocated to that caste for the betterment of the whole of society. And all put together. Oh, and then of course there would be one very essential part that any modern civilization must have. There would be the heart. And the heart, of course, would be, in today's terms, defined as the bureaucrats, as bureaucracy. Because we need bureaucrats. Bureaucrats would represent the pulmonary system. They would represent the circulatory system, the heart. They would keep everything moving between the different body parts and serve as interlocutors between all the different castes, and they would bind the whole thing together. And they would have no political power, of course, because it's a terrible idea to give political power to bureaucrats beyond what is strictly necessary for their day-to-day functionality. But they would nonetheless be the glue that holds everything together and does all of the bureaucratic work that makes a complex society work. And all put together, I firmly believe that a society functioning the way I've described would be the ideal human society. Taking into account the, not the flaws, but taking into account human nature, because most societies in human history have relied upon an idealized depiction of the human mind and what makes us tick, what drives us. But my vision of the ideal society would be something more realistic and pragmatic, I think, recognizing that people have different strengths and different weaknesses, and we need to really identify what those strengths and weaknesses are in our individual cases, and then sort of reach a definition of ourselves and work together, pooling our strengths, covering each other's weaknesses, and watching each other's backs and pulling together as much as possible, and each being content in his or her own nature. Because that's what it ultimately comes down to, is that we need to be content in who we are and not endlessly striving for things that we can't realistically reach, things that we can't realistically seize hold of. Because in most societies today, people are told that if they don't reach the very top, the very peak of excellence, if they aren't the richest, the smartest, the most accomplished, the best at whatever they set themselves to, then they're treated as less. And I think this vision for a future society would largely preclude that, because although some castes would have greater responsibility in different different fields and different areas of governance, ultimately everyone would be valued the same. Members of the body, of the corpus, would not be thought of as any less than those in the leadership caste. They would be simply given different responsibilities, as recognizing that people are different and we have different strengths and we have different weaknesses, and we should accept those and strengthen ourselves in those ways that we are strongest, and not strive for things that we know deep down we can't achieve. There are things for each of us that we simply aren't suited to, and that's perfectly okay. And that's my point, is that it is completely okay for everyone to simply accept his or her own place in the scheme of things. And once someone has authentically discovered what that place is, then commit yourself to it and be proud of it, and define yourself that way. That can be your identity. It doesn't need to be anything as flimsy as a career, or as limiting as race. It doesn't need to be anything as intangible as religion. It can be something much more universal and profound and potentially eternal. Because a civilization functioning like that could be eternal, or as eternal as any civilization could be. But it would draw upon the strengths of its people so well, and it would deny the weaknesses of its people. Deny in the sense of not letting them manifest into anything self-destructive, not denying their existence, of course. But it would prevent weaknesses from undercutting the work of the civilization, and it would empower the strengths of the civilization and the people who make it up to potentially stave off the inward collapse, the implosion that almost always strikes down great civilizations. Rarely do great civilizations fall from without, the old cliche, which is largely true, that, great civilizations usually don't fall from without. They reach great power, and then they grow complacent and they rot away from within. But in a society where everyone truly understands his or her own place and purpose within that civilization, within that society, and moves harmoniously with everyone else, then we need not fear any inward collapse. We don't need to fear any implosion because, for example, there would be no fear of like a corrupt monarchy, a monarchy falling into decadence and collapsing, failing to rule properly, because the leadership caste would simply, choose those members best suited to the task, and they would refresh itself, like human cells, refreshing themselves constantly and not falling into decay, recognizing when its time has passed and when a new thing needs to take its place. And similarly, unlike in democracies and republican forms of government, there would be no need to fear a misguided populace from choosing the wrong course and being seduced by false promises and destroying their own civilization from within in the vain pursuit of something they believe to be better. Because, the vast majority of the population simply wouldn't have any say in the running of their society, which ultimately may be for the better. I'm not saying that democracy is terrible or anything like that. I think it is, at present, probably the best of limited options when it comes to forms of human governance. But it is also far from perfect and frequently leads to inward collapse because people get complacent and they make stupid decisions and it destroys their civilization. And we would never, the ideal society, as I'm describing it, would never encounter any of these problems because everyone would simply move towards the goal that is best for themselves and therefore best for society as a whole.